The morning of St. Crispin's Fair arrived with a sort of resigned cheerfulness, the kind reserved for annual events that have long outlived their excitement, yet still persist out of habit and decency. The townspeople of Flaxborough, who regarded novelty with suspicion, found comfort in the same stalls, the same raffle prizes, and the same arguments about whether last year's jam tent had been better organised. Mrs. Ada Beasley, a widow of indeterminate piety and precise habits, presided over her table of antiques, or, more accurately, unclassifiable relics awaiting an identity. A brass kettle dented by history stood beside a headless china shepherdess, and, among these, the object that drew the first crowd of the day, a lantern that glowed faintly from within. It was no ordinary light. The glow was soft and constant, not flickering like a candle, nor humming like an electric bulb. Children pointed. Their mothers frowned. "Battery hidden underneath," said one. "Devil's work," murmured another, less in fear than in hope of amusement. Mrs. Beasley, without lifting her gaze, said, "It does that on its own. Been doing so since my late husband found it in a chest years ago. Never known why, never cared to." Her tone made clear she preferred admiration to inquiry. Mr. Codd, who had been churchwarden since before the flood that hadn't quite happened, tapped the lantern with a knuckle. "Bit of radium, I shouldn't wonder." The remark earned him a thin smile. "Then you shouldn't," Mrs. Beasley replied. From behind the throng, a tall man in a dark overcoat watched. His expression was polite, but his eyes were fixed too steadily for casual interest. When at last he spoke, it was with the sort of courtesy that makes one listen twice. "That's an uncommon piece," he said. "Might I ask if it's for sale?" "That depends," Mrs. Beasley replied, straightening a small mirror already spotless. "I don't sell to everyone," the man inclined his head. "I'm an antiques dealer, Draycott, only visiting the fair this week." "Then you'll know the value of things," she said. "And that not everything that glitters or glows is meant to change hands." The dealer smiled faintly as if to conceal irritation. "Perhaps we might discuss it later when there's less excitement." "Perhaps," she answered, and turned to haggle over a teapot with a woman who seemed to think rudeness a form of thrift. By afternoon, word of the ghost lamp had spread through the fairground. People who would normally avoid the antique stalls stopped to look, drawn by the suggestion that something supernatural, or at least mildly unexplainable, was occurring in respectable daylight. The vicar, passing by, muttered a blessing without breaking stride. As dusk fell, Mrs. Beasley's lantern seemed brighter, its pale greenish glow a small defiance against the deepening blue of evening. Several onlookers swore they could see shapes moving within the glass, like mist caught in thought. A child tried to touch it, and was briskly pulled away by his mother, who later told 3 friends it had made the boy's fingers tingle. At 9:30, the fair began to close. The steam organ gave its final weary gasp, and the smell of fried onions yielded to that of damp canvas. Mrs. Beasley was last seen rearranging her goods into neat parcels. A few noticed the tall stranger return, though from a distance it appeared they merely exchanged a few words. When Constable Love made his final patrol an hour later, the table was empty. No stall, no lantern, no Mrs. Beasley. Only a faint smudge on the cobbles where the lamp had stood. A ring of soot, or perhaps polish, was left behind. By morning, the fairground was bare except for litter, and one broken string of bunting fluttering half-heartedly in the breeze. Mrs. Beasley's house on North Lane remained locked. The milk stood untouched on her step, a thin skin of cream forming like the first layer of silence over an absence, and though no one in Flaxborough yet knew it, the light that had burned without flame had gone out only in the most literal sense. Something else, something far less tidy, had just begun to glow. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Flaxborough's market square had resumed its weekday calm, or something close to it. The bunting from the fair still hung in tatters, fluttering with an air of embarrassed persistence. What should have been a simple matter of clearing up had become, instead, a subject for deep and unqualified speculation. It began, as such things do, with Mrs. Kemp at the post office, who informed her first customer that poor Ada Beasley's gone off, lantern and all, though I dare say she's more likely run than been taken. By the time that customer reached the butcher's, the story had developed into a kidnapping by a foreign dealer after a magic lamp. At the hairdresser's, Mrs. Kemp's account had grown still brighter. The lantern now emitted holy light, and Mrs. Beasley had vanished in a beam of it. Purbright, who entered the tea-room around 11's, was greeted by a hum of competing narratives. The waitresses, moving between tables with the solemnity of clergy, exchanged morsels of gossip between orders. He took his usual seat by the window and listened, stirring his tea long after the sugar had dissolved. "Gone, lock, stock, and brass polish," one voice said.
"House all tidy, though. Too tidy."
"That's always a bad sign. Perhaps she's eloped," another suggested, with the relish of someone rehearsing envy. "With whom?" a third countered. "She's 70 if she's a day, and he'd have to be blind to fancy her." "I heard she was spiritual," said the first, "held séances in her kitchen. Maybe the lantern called her home." Purbright's expression didn't change, but his eyes shifted slightly as he looked out into the square. Constable Love was there, trying to question the man who owned the coconut shy, though from the constable's slouched stance, it appeared he was learning more about coconuts than witnesses. At the next table, Mrs. Dakin of the Women's Guild was holding court. She spoke with the firmness of one who knows that certainty is louder than truth.
"It's a warning," she declared.
That woman was meddling with unchristian forces.
"I said so last year when she brought those fortune cards to the jumble." "Yes," murmured Miss Parkin, her eyes darting with enjoyment.
And remember the vicar's sermon the next Sunday? He said, "Let not false lights guide your steps." That must have been about her. Purbright sipped his tea thoughtfully. A false light, he reflected, was an apt enough description for any number of things in Flaxborough: street lamps, moral convictions, and occasionally people. As he rose to leave, Mrs. Roper from the council office intercepted him, clutching a notebook and speaking in an eager rush. "Inspector, I suppose you've heard about Mrs. Beasley's disappearance?"
"Terrible business."
"But you'll find she wasn't quite right in the head, you know. She told me once her late husband spoke through a gas meter." Purbright nodded mildly. "Did he say anything useful?" She blinked.
"Well, no, I imagine not." "Pity," he said. "Well, we could do with a few practical ghosts." He walked out into the square.
The air had turned damp and grey, the kind of weather that encouraged both mildew and moral reflection.
Love approached, notebook in hand, his expression a mixture of earnestness and apology. "Nothing yet, sir."
"I've spoken to the stallholders. Most packed up around 9:30.
None saw her leave.
The lantern, too, gone clean. Did anyone notice the stranger again, the tall one, well-dressed? One or two think they did.
One woman swears he was carrying something under his coat.
Another says she saw him arguing with Mrs. Beasley near the fountain. And which woman is more likely to tell the truth? Love hesitated. "Neither, sir." "But one of them had the better hat." Purbright smiled faintly. "Then we'll assume she's the liar. Vanity makes a poor witness." They walked together across the cobbles, stopping where the faint ring of soot still marked the spot of the lantern's last appearance. It was smaller than Purbright had expected, barely wider than a dinner plate, but its presence was oddly insistent, as though the earth itself had taken note of something it shouldn't. "Looks like something burned," Love said. "Yes," Purbright murmured, "but perhaps not what one would expect. If there'd been a fire, there'd be more than a memory of it." Love stared blankly, waiting for further instruction. None came. Purbright's gaze lingered on the mark a moment longer before he turned away, buttoning his coat. "Check Mrs. Beasley's house again," he said. "No drawers opened, No money taken, no letters left behind. The usual dull things that don't quite add up. Sir? And love, he added quietly, if anyone offers you a glowing lantern at a discount, do buy it. We might need another. Love frowned in confusion, but Purbright's expression betrayed nothing. The inspector crossed the square at an unhurried pace, the faint scrape of his shoes lost beneath the murmur of new rumours forming, fresh versions already brighter, stranger, and less true than the last. Inspector Purbright began his inquiries in the manner most acceptable to the citizens of Flaxborough. Politely, persistently, and without the faintest hint of urgency, he called first upon the Reverend Chubb at St. Crispin's vicarage, reasoning that few events in town passed without eventually acquiring a moral interpretation. The vicar received him in a room that smelt of damp hymnals and resigned piety. "Mrs. Beasley?" Chubb said, steepling his fingers. "Ah, yes. She was a regular at evensong, though I hesitate to describe her attendance as devotional. One sometimes felt she came to check for errors in the liturgy." "She was known to keep a lantern that glowed," Purbright said mildly. The vicar frowned. "A vulgar superstition, Inspector. The woman claimed it was blessed. I told her that blessed objects should not hum or smoke. Did she appear afraid of anything?" "Afraid? No, though she had that particular brand of calm that belongs to those who've grown too accustomed to secrets." He smiled thinly. "You'll find many such in Flaxborough." Purbright thanked him, left his card upon the table, and stepped out into the square. The drizzle had begun again, fine, impartial rain that blurred edges and opinions alike. From there he walked to the council hall, where Mr. Piggott, the fair's organizer, was accounting for the profits and losses with the care of a man auditing his own honesty. "She was late setting up," Piggott said, adjusting his spectacles. "Said she'd had a visit from a buyer, asked me if there'd be security about after dark."
"I told her she needn't worry, no one steals brass and crockery." Purbright raised an eyebrow.
"Yet someone did." "Ah, yes."
"Odd that." Piggott's tone suggested that oddness was an unavoidable occupational hazard of living in Flaxborough.
"Still, she always was touchy about that lantern. Wouldn't let me list it in the programme." "Did she name her buyer?" "Draycott or something close. Claimed to be from Lincoln. Wore gloves even indoors." The inspector made a note. The handwriting was tidy but unhurried, a sign not of indifference but of thought saved for later. His next call was on Mr. Draycott himself, located after discreet inquiries at the Railway Arms, where his room was paid through the week. The man received him with the composure of someone practiced at both selling and explaining Mrs. Beasley's disappearance. He repeated,
"Dreadful thing, truly.
I'd only met her once at the fair.
I made an offer for that curious lantern, strictly business, you understand. But she seemed affronted."
Said it wasn't for sale to men who valued things wrongly. I took my leave shortly after. Purbright regarded him with mild curiosity. "You travel often?"
"Continuously."
"Auctions, private sales, that sort of work?"
"I'm due in Newark tomorrow." "You'll forgive me if I ask you not to be," Purbright said pleasantly.
"We may need you here a little longer." Draycott's smile did not falter, but the fingers resting on his cuff twitched once, then stilled. "Of course, Inspector. Anything to help. But truly, I can't imagine where the woman's gone."
"Elderly folk sometimes, well, they wander." "Yes," Purbright said softly.
"Though rarely without their purses." Back at the station, he found Constable Love poring over the house key retrieved from Mrs. Beasley's milkman.
Front door locked, sir."
Curtains drawn.
"Everything shipshape. Anything missing?"
Not a thing of worth. Food untouched, bed made. She's vanished neat as a broom cupboard." Purbright looked out the window toward the square, where market carts now stood empty under the rain. And the town, Love, has already supplied its own explanations. Ghosts, lovers, conspiracies, all very satisfying. Which means the truth, when we find it, will be much duller. Duller, sir?
"Usually."
But occasionally dullness hides its face behind something that glows. He turned back to his desk, opened the incident ledger, and with deliberate calm wrote beneath the day's date. Interviewed vicar, fair official and suspect. Contradictions apparent, but none aware of them yet. As he closed the book, his reflection caught in the office glass, a pale shape surrounded by the lamplight. For a fleeting instant, it seemed to flicker, as though his own outline borrowed something of the lantern's strange persistence. Then it steadied, and he smiled faintly to himself. By the following morning, Constable Love had developed what he considered a solid theory. Solid, that is, by the comfortable standards of Flaxborough policing, where most crimes could be traced either to envy or drink. He appeared at Purbright's desk, armed with enthusiasm and a faint smell of boot polish. "It's Draycott, sir." "Must be. He's the only stranger about, and strangers are generally guilty till proven otherwise." The man had opportunity, motive, and an unnatural interest in lighting appliances. Purbright looked up from his paperwork, his expression unreadable but faintly amused. "So we both killed and tidied, you think, sir? The house, love? Mrs. Beasley's, not a hair displaced, not a crumb disturbed. Criminals rarely wipe the sideboard." Love hesitated. "Perhaps he's the tidy sort, sir?" "Then I shall revise my suspicions toward monks and undertakers," Purbright murmured. Still, procedure required attention, and Purbright was not above letting enthusiasm perform its useful early blundering. Draycott was brought in that afternoon, not under arrest, but under the polite fiction of assisting the police. He arrived looking faintly affronted, though his composure never cracked. "I've told you everything, Inspector," he said. "I made an offer for the lantern. She refused. I left."
"I haven't the slightest idea what became of her." Purbright regarded him steadily.
"It is an odd business, Mr. Draycott. Mrs. Beasley vanishes, yet her property remains immaculate. No forced entry, no missing valuables. Just her and a lantern. You'll admit that's rather a specific choice of theft." The man shrugged. "People vanish all the time. Perhaps she took it with her. Perhaps she was eccentric enough to walk off into the night. Indeed, though she left her overcoat, her handbag, and her teeth. That made Draycott blink, though only once."
"Then I can't explain it." Purbright smiled faintly.
"Few can at first." After the interview, Love was convinced the suspect's evasiveness confirmed his guilt. "You saw him twitch when you mentioned the teeth, sir. Man's hiding something." "Yes," Purbright said, slipping the note into his file. "But not necessarily what you think." The local paper, alerted by an overzealous clerk, produced an article by the next morning titled "Dealer Questioned in Lantern Mystery." The headline was accompanied by a photograph of a lamp that was neither ancient nor relevant, but which the editor thought set the mood. By noon, half the town had accepted Draycott's guilt as civic fact, while the other half simply enjoyed having something new to disapprove of. Mrs. Dakin, ever vigilant, remarked in the tea-room that men who come from elsewhere never do so for honest reasons, and the chorus of agreement was nearly unanimous, save for one voice, belonging to Mrs. Bloxham, Mrs. Beasley's next-door neighbour. She stirred her tea with determined care. "I heard nothing that night," she said, "except the sound of polishing, like someone rubbing at metal, steady-like, and there was a smell sweet, sharp. Reminded me of those old brass cleaners my father used." Purbright, who had drifted near enough to overhear without appearing to eavesdrop, thanked her quietly. "Did you mention this to anyone before?" She looked up, startled.
"Well, no, Inspector. I thought it was nothing." "Nothing," he said,
"is sometimes the most interesting sort of something." Back at the station, he drew a small square on his blotter, a habit when thinking, and wrote 3 words beneath it. Polish, residue, purpose, love hovering nearby. Asked whether they ought to search Draycott's lodgings again. "Later," Purbright replied. "For now, we'll let the man enjoy his innocence. It tends to rattle those who haven't earned it." He leaned back, hands folded, his gaze unfocused but attentive. The smell of polish, the spotless room, the lantern's glow, each piece quiet in its own corner, not yet speaking to the others. But Purbright had the sense that when they did, it would not be of Draycott's guilt alone. Outside, the drizzle returned, softening the cobbles of the market square. The newspaper boy shouted the day's headline through the mist, and in the tea-room Mrs. Dakin rehearsed her triumph for having suspected the dealer first. Flaxborough, having found its villain, settled comfortably into moral certainty. Purbright, however, looked out through his rain-streaked window and murmured, almost to himself, "Convenience is never so suspicious as when everyone agrees with it." Purbright walked the short distance to North Lane that afternoon, umbrella in hand and thoughts in orderly disarray. The drizzle persisted, flattening the colour from everything but the red of the post-box and the mild green of Mrs. Beasley's front door. A constable waited there, his notebook damp and useless. He looked relieved to see the inspector. "Nothing new, sir?" No signs of struggle, no forced locks. "Her niece came by earlier, took fright at the quiet, I think." Purbright nodded and dismissed him. He entered the house. The air within had that careful stillness of rooms, kept clean more for conscience than company. Everything stood in modest order, curtains drawn halfway, a vase of faded chrysanthemums placed exactly central on the mantelpiece, a sense of absence so neat it seemed deliberate. He walked slowly from room to room. Each bore the signature of someone who lived tidily but without warmth. No dust, no clutter, not even a letter left open. On the dining table lay a folded cloth protecting a row of small brass ornaments, candlesticks, a clock, a key-holder, all polished to weary perfection. He paused, noticing a faint, dark smear on the cloth near the edge.
A fingertip revealed soot, or perhaps something more curious. In the kitchen he found a half-burned candle resting inside a cup, odd for a house with working electricity.
Nearby, a bottle of brass cleaner stood uncapped. He sniffed, sharp, acrid, with a sweetness that lingered unpleasantly. The smell recalled the neighbour's comment. He replaced it carefully. A receipt pinned to the pantry door caught his attention. Thompson and Hill, brass restorer, 4 Oz. Paid. The date was 4 days before the fair. He folded it, slipped it into his pocket, and turned toward the parlour. There, the hearth had been swept, too clean.
Even the iron grate shone.
But above the mantelpiece, one detail jarred, the faint square of lighter wallpaper where a picture had clearly hung until recently. Every other frame remained in place, portraits of mild relatives, a print of the Queen, and a watercolour of an indeterminate river. But this single absence left a mark of intent. He stood a moment, hands clasped behind his back, as though addressing the silence. "Too clean, Mrs. Beasley," he murmured. "Far too considerate for someone merely vanished." A faint ticking came from a small clock under the window. Its regular rhythm, soft and dry, filled the room. Purbright stared at it, noticing the brass edges bore the same residue as the dining cloth, thin black dust clinging where polish had failed to reach. He lifted the clock, examined its base, then smiled faintly. "So," he said quietly, "not flame, but heat." He returned the clock and opened the back door. The small garden beyond was overgrown, yet oddly trampled in a neat line from the door to the shed. Inside, the shed was as spare as the house, empty tins, a broom, and a single cardboard box. Within the box lay a few fragments of metal, thin curved pieces, perhaps broken from something larger, and a scrap of glass dulled by soot. He turned one piece over. Faintly etched into the brass was a letter. B, and the beginning of another. He wrapped the pieces carefully in his handkerchief and stepped outside, pausing beneath the dripping eaves. The town beyond the hedge seemed far away, still gossiping itself into certainty, while the truth lingered quietly. Waiting to be noticed, back at the station, he laid the fragments on his desk under the yellow light. They caught it in a tired glimmer, like coins long buried. Love entered, holding 2 cups of tea and looking hopeful. "Anything, sir?" "A few trifles," Purbright said. A missing picture, some soot where there should be shine, and a clock that behaves like it's been near a furnace. Love frowned. Doesn't sound much. It never does at first. The curious thing about trifles, love, is how patiently they wait to become evidence. He reached for his pen, hesitated, then added a note beside Draycott's name. Possible connection. Objects altered, not stolen. He tapped the page with his finger. Someone wanted to hide what was true by making everything else too perfect.
And that, he said softly, is never done for nothing. Outside,
the church bell marked 6 o'clock, and the light in Purbright's office dimmed to the same greenish hue the lantern had once given off, a coincidence of weather and memory that made him pause before closing his notebook. For a moment, the inspector allowed himself to imagine the faint pulse of that impossible glow, somewhere still burning behind a locked door. By the following morning, Flaxborough had returned to its customary murmur of activity, though now laced with the sort of curiosity that gives respectability its rare excitement. Mrs. Hatch, at the drapery, was heard to remark that poor Mrs. Beasley had always seemed a little too tidy for comfort, while Mr. Creek, the town clerk, told anyone within range that the whole affair was probably domestic and best left unprodded, which in Flaxborough guaranteed it would be prodded thoroughly. Inspector Purbright arrived at the police station with a newspaper under his arm and a mild look of having slept, if not restfully, then at least efficiently. The fragments of brass lay where he had left them, dull in the morning light. He examined them again before turning to Sergeant Love. "Fetch me the file on Draycott's fairground permit, if you please, and see if we have any record of Mrs. Beasley's correspondences over the last year. Letters, complaints, parish notes." Love nodded, somewhat daunted by the inspector's habit of treating the improbable as inevitable. "Do you think she's dead, sir?" Purbright regarded him mildly. "I think she is absent in a way that requires explanation. The difference, love, is mostly paperwork." At 11 he walked to the council offices where Mr. Creek sat behind his desk, rearranging papers into piles that suggested authority rather than order. Purbright asked quietly about Mrs. Beasley's duties as treasurer of the All Souls Lantern Fund, a local charity whose sole purpose seemed to be maintaining a Victorian lamp outside the churchyard. Creek brightened. This was a subject he could expand upon without risk. "Oh yes, the fund's been ticking over nicely. We collect modest donations at the Midsummer Fete. Mrs. Beasley took care of the accounts. Always meticulous, though I suppose that comes of living alone?" "Quite," said Purbright. "Do you happen to know where the lantern itself is stored?" "Stored? Good heavens, no.
It's never moved."
"You can see it from the vestry path. Old cast-iron thing. Doesn't work, of course." Purbright thanked him, then called at the vicarage. The Reverend Wainfleet, a thin man with a watery voice, received him as though expecting confession rather than inquiry. "The lamp, Inspector?" "Oh, it's been out of order for years. We had it polished once, I recall, though Mrs. Beasley objected. She said the light it gave, when it did give any, wasn't quite natural."
I assumed she meant the colour. Purbright considered this. "And who did the polishing?"
"Mr. Draycott, I believe. He was repairing the fairground carousel at the time and offered to clean the brass fittings for us." "Very obliging." A pause settled between them, the kind born of mutual politeness concealing separate unease. Purbright thanked the vicar and took his leave. On his way back through the churchyard, he paused before the lantern itself. It was a handsome relic, wrought in curving leaves and narrow panes of glass that caught the dull daylight without reflection. The fittings had been recently cleaned, too recently, in fact. A faint trace of polish lingered, and around the base the soil looked freshly disturbed. Kneeling, he brushed away a small ridge of dirt. Beneath it, the outline of something square, a box or a small case, pressed faintly through the earth. He stood again, brushing off his hand, and looked toward the church door, where Reverend Wainfleet was watching nervously through the frosted glass. Purbright gave him a genial nod and turned away. There was no need to startle the clergy. Not yet. By late afternoon he sat once more at his desk. Love entered with the requested file and a fresh pot of tea.
Permit records, sir.
And I found this in the parish correspondence, letter from Mrs. Beasley to the Reverend about funds for the lantern. Fund mentions that Draycott's work was not to her satisfaction. Purbright took the letter,
Reading it slowly.
The handwriting was tidy and angular, each word pressed with the firmness of someone unused to apology. At the end, a brief postscript. He asked to keep one of the old fittings as a souvenir.
I refused. Purbright leaned back.
Souvenirs are sentimental things, love, and sentiment is a poor excuse for persistence. If Draycott wanted that brass badly enough to argue, perhaps he found another way. Love frowned.
But what about Mrs. Beasley, sir?
That, love, Purbright said softly, is what happens when sentiment meets caution, and one of them burns without flame. He turned the brass fragments over once more in his palm, feeling their cold weight. In the stillness of the office, he thought he heard, though perhaps only imagined, the faintest hum, like something waiting to glow. It was just after dusk when the second incident occurred, though few in Flaxborough would have called it that until the next morning. At first, it was only a smell, a faint sweetness carried on the chill air, noticed by the milkman as he cycled past the churchyard. By morning, that sweetness had thickened into something unmistakably wrong. Purbright arrived before breakfast, summoned by the constable on duty, who looked rather green about the face. A small crowd of townsfolk had already gathered at the gates, whispering with that restrained excitement particular to respectable scandal. The inspector moved through them with calm indifference, pausing only to acknowledge Mrs. Hatch, who clutched her handbag like a weapon. Inside the churchyard, the air hung heavy with the odour of burnt polish and damp earth. The old lantern stood crooked, its base blackened, the soil beneath it disturbed and still faintly steaming. The ironwork, once dull and neat, now bore strange scorch marks that fanned upward like veins of rusted silver. Purbright crouched beside it, careful not to touch the metal. No ordinary fire, he said softly. No candle or match could burn so cleanly. Love, who had arrived breathless, peered down with cautious disgust. Do you think someone set it alight on purpose, sir? I think, Purbright replied, someone was trying to make something disappear and succeeded almost. From the scorched soil, a constable had already retrieved a few objects. A piece of cracked glass, a melted key, and something far more disturbing, a small metal brooch, twisted but still identifiable as a floral pattern.
Love recognized it immediately. Mrs. Beasley's, sir?
She wore it at the fair. Purbright said nothing for several moments. Then he stood, glancing toward the vicarage window, where Reverend Wainfleet's curtain twitched with faint horror. You might tell the vicar that his churchyard has, regrettably, become a crime scene, he murmured. By midday, word had reached every corner of town, embroidered richly by conjecture. In the café, Mrs. Bannister confided that she had always known the lamp had the devil in it. At the library, Mr. Creek declared that modern chemicals were to blame, though he could not specify which. Back at the station, the inspector listened to these reports with mild detachment as Love relayed them. Then he rose, hat in hand. "We'll call on Mr. Draycott again," he said. "It seems his handiwork refuses to rest." The fairground was quieter now, stripped of its gaiety. Draycott's van stood by the gate, its paint flaking and the smell of turpentine strong enough to sting. He greeted them with wary civility. "Terrible business about that old lamp, Inspector. Heard it on the wireless." "Shame that?" Purbright examined him for a moment.
Indeed, you worked on it, I believe.
"Only polished it, like I said. Nothing more. You can't blame me if it's gone up in smoke." Purbright's eyes travelled to the cluttered bench behind him. Among the tools and scraps of wire lay a small mould, brass, half filled with hardened resin. He touched it lightly. "Interesting."
I'd have thought you gave up brass work. Draycott shifted uneasily.
"Old hobby, that's all. Keeps me busy." Purbright smiled in the mild, patient way that usually preceded discomfort in others. A useful hobby, especially if one wished to make a copy of something that was once quite valuable, or perhaps illuminating. Draycott flushed.
You've no right to accuse no accusation, Purbright said evenly.
Only curiosity. Mrs. Beasley was known for her tidiness. I wonder what she'd think of your shed. The silence thickened. Somewhere outside, a loose shutter creaked in the wind. Love's pencil scratched faintly in his notebook. At last, Draycott exhaled through his nose. She was a difficult woman. Didn't want anyone touching her things. Treated that lamp like it were treasure. Said it had belonged to her father.
I only wanted one bit of brass, just a keepsake. Purbright regarded him steadily.
And she refused. She did. He swallowed. Called me greedy, the inspector nodded slowly. And yet, Mr. Draycott, greed seldom stops at refusal.
It seeks a way around it. Draycott's hands tightened on the edge of the workbench. You think
I think, Purbright said, that the lamp was more than it seemed, and someone, in trying to hide what it revealed, has let something else show instead. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. One more thing, he said without turning. If you should remember where you disposed of your brass cleaner, do let us know. We seem to have run short. The door closed softly behind him. Draycott stood motionless for several seconds, then wiped his hands on his apron, leaving two dark streaks that trembled faintly as he stared at the smouldering remnants of his workbench lamp. Outside, the inspector walked back toward the square, the evening sun struggling weakly through the mist. Love, he said quietly, keep an eye on him tonight. Our Mr. Draycott is about to discover that conscience burns longer than brass. Night pressed close around the station. The kind of stillness peculiar to small towns after scandal has exhausted its gossip for the day. The constables had gone home, leaving Purbright's office half-lit by a single lamp that hummed faintly with age. He sat before the open window, coat still buttoned, pipe unlit in one hand. The smell of burnt brass clung faintly to his sleeve, a reminder of the morning's discovery. There was something about the entire affair that refused to settle into shape, not the disappearance itself, nor even the odd chemistry of the scorched lantern, but the pattern of people around it, their small vanities and quiet fears, all circling a relic no one seemed to value until it was gone. He had seen this before in Flaxborough, how objects collected the residue of human feeling until they became, in their own way, dangerous. He thought of Mrs. Beasley, her meticulousness, her solitude, her need to preserve the precise boundaries of her world. Such people lived by order because they feared chaos, yet it was often their own hidden disorder that undid them. Perhaps, he reflected, Mrs. Beasley had guarded the lantern not for its worth, but because it reminded her of something she could no longer control. Love entered quietly, hat in hand. We've been keeping watch on Draycott, sir. He hasn't left his workshop all evening.
Light still on, though, Purbright nodded. Good. Conscience seldom sleeps under lamplight. Love hesitated.
Sir, if I might ask, do you think Mrs. Beasley's really gone?
I mean dead?
Purbright tapped his pipe thoughtfully. Gone, yes. Dead. Not necessarily in the usual sense. Love frowned. I don't follow, sir. That's quite all right, said Purbright mildly. Neither do I entirely. He rose and walked to the window. Across the square, the faint shimmer of the church lantern, now covered by police sheeting, caught the lamplight in a way that made it look almost alive. He spoke softly, more to the night than to love. There's something very human about trying to preserve light. We polish, mend, and guard it, even when it's long ceased to serve its purpose. Mrs. Beasley did that. Draycott, too, in his way. Each believed they could control what they didn't understand. Love looked uneasy.
You make it sound like witchcraft, sir. Purbright smiled faintly.
Nothing so glamorous. Just the usual ingredients, pride, guilt, and a dash of curiosity. But when mixed in the dark, they burn rather more brightly than reason. He returned to his desk, opening his notebook. On one page, he had drawn a rough sketch of the lantern's base, marking the disturbed soil, the scorch pattern, and the position of the melted key. Beneath it he wrote object used as concealment, not source. He stared at the words, unsatisfied, then added another line. If heat was external, who struck the match? A clock somewhere down the corridor chimed 10. Purbright replaced his pen, extinguished the lamp, and took his coat. Come along, love, a walk will do us both good. They crossed the square under the weak glow of the streetlights. The air was damp, metallic, carrying the faintest smell of rain. The vicarage stood silent now, curtains drawn, its windows reflecting the faint orange of the town lamps. Beyond the churchyard gates a constable kept watch, his breath visible in the cold. Purbright nodded to him.
Any disturbances? None, sir. Quiet as a tomb. The inspector's mouth twitched. An unfortunate choice of phrase, constable. They entered the churchyard, moving slowly among the headstones.
The covered lantern loomed like a shrouded monument, the earth around it dark and uneven. Purbright knelt once more, brushing the edge of the tarp aside. Beneath it, the soil had sunk slightly since morning, as though something beneath had cooled and settled. He touched the ground with his fingertips. It was cold but oddly dry, sir? Love whispered. Purbright stood again. Our fire was not chemical alone. There's been heat from within. Whatever burned here, love, burned willingly. Love stared, baffled.
How can... Patience, Purbright said gently.
Even guilt can ignite, if pressed long enough. As they turned to leave, a faint sound reached them, a clink of metal against stone. The constable by the gate straightened. Purbright raised a hand for silence. The sound came again, sharper this time, from the far edge of the graveyard near the vestry door. They moved toward it quietly. There, half hidden behind a low wall, stood a bicycle. On the ground beside it, something glimmered, a small brass fitting, newly polished, catching the lantern light that wasn't there. Purbright bent and picked it up. The surface was warm. He said nothing for a long moment, then slipped it into his pocket and turned toward Love. Tell the constable to stay alert.
And keep watch on Draycott still.
But not too closely. A guilty man must be allowed to think he's nearly safe before he tells us the truth. They walked back through the silent square, the inspector deep in thought. Behind them, the churchyard remained dark, but somewhere within that darkness, the faintest ember of reflection seemed to glint upon the tarp, something neither moon nor lamp could claim to have caused. By the next afternoon, Flaxborough's chatter had reached such a pitch that even the parish bells seemed to toll in self-defence. Theories now ranged from spectral vengeance to insurance fraud, with several citizens managing to believe both simultaneously. Purbright, however, appeared untouched by the town's fever of certainty. He spent the morning at his desk, sorting through the parish correspondence again. Though Love suspected his attention was elsewhere, at noon, the inspector closed his file and said, almost casually, "We shall pay Mr. Draycott another visit. But this time, Love, we'll invite company." An hour later, the vicarage parlour held an unlikely assembly. Reverend Wainfleet, anxious and perspiring, Mr. Creek, clutching his briefcase like a moral anchor, and Draycott himself, summoned under the polite pretext of clarifying certain repairs. Purbright presided over them all with the mild air of a man arranging tea rather than truth. "Gentlemen," he began, "thank you for your patience. You'll forgive me for this informal meeting, but I find that misunderstandings are best cleared in daylight. Particularly when they concern lanterns." Draycott gave a short, nervous laugh.
"I've told you everything I know, Inspector." "Of course," Purbright said pleasantly.
"But you see, the matter is not quite settled. The lantern, for instance, it burned rather spectacularly."
"Odd, don't you think, for something that hadn't worked in years?"
Creek cleared his throat. "Or suggesting some kind of chemical reaction, I presume." Purbright looked amused. "Chemical, moral, or financial, it's difficult to distinguish in Flaxborough." He turned his gaze to Draycott. "You see, when I visited your shed the other day, I noticed a mould. Brass casting, if I'm not mistaken.
An expensive hobby for a fairground mechanic. Draycott shifted uneasily.
Old scrap.
Nothing worth keeping.
Indeed, yet you did keep it. Purbright's tone was conversational, but his eyes had sharpened. And when Mrs. Beasley refused you that souvenir, as you called it, you decided to make your own. You took the fitting from the lantern, cast a copy, and then, when she discovered the theft, you returned the false piece and hid the original. Wainfleet gasped.
Good heavens!
Draycott's face reddened. You've no proof of that? Purbright inclined his head.
On the contrary, I've quite a bit.
The fragment recovered from the churchyard last night. He drew from his pocket the small, polished piece he had found. Fits the missing section of the lantern perfectly. And this one, he placed another on the table, came from your workbench. The difference is in the alloy. Yours contains resin, not metal. Draycott's mouth opened, then closed again. The inspector continued mildly. Now, Mrs. Beasley was not a forgiving woman. She must have confronted you.
There may even have been a quarrel.
But I suspect she made an unfortunate decision. To hide the true piece of brass herself, perhaps in that box buried beneath the lantern's base.
And you, in a moment of alarm or anger, decided she would not be missed if her house were left quiet and tidy. Creek's briefcase dropped with a soft thud.
You're accusing this man of murder?
Accusing?
No, said Purbright softly. I'm describing the sequence of events as logic suggests them.
Murder implies intent, and I rather think our Mr. Draycott acted more out of panic than plan. Draycott slammed a hand against the table. You've got it all wrong. She slipped. I only meant to frighten her.
She fell, hit her head.
I didn't mean for it to happen.
The silence that followed was immense, disturbed only by the faint ticking of the vicar's mantel clock. Purbright sighed gently, as if regretful that his prediction had proved accurate so soon. I thought as much, he said quietly. And afterward you hid her beneath the lantern, using her own brass polish to disguise the soil. You burned what you could to erase the traces, but brass remembers heat, Mr. Draycott, much as conscience does. Draycott's shoulders sagged.
I didn't want to hurt her, he whispered. I just wanted my bit of metal back. It was mine by right. I'd restored it.
Ownership, Purbright observed, is rarely the same as deserving. Love, pale but composed, stepped forward to take Draycott's arm. The man did not resist. The vicar murmured a prayer that none quite heard, while Creek fussed with his briefcase, pretending not to tremble. Purbright walked to the window and looked out at the square, where the first lamps of evening were being lit. You see, gentlemen, he said quietly, light has a habit of showing more than we intend, and sometimes it burns those who try too hard to make it shine. The confession, once given, settled over the room like a faint, inevitable dusk. No one spoke for several moments. Draycott stood staring at the floor, his hands limp at his sides, as though surrender itself were an unfamiliar posture. Love guided him quietly toward the door, murmuring something practical about the car. Wainfleet, pale and shaken, sank into an armchair and began folding and unfolding his handkerchief with a distracted precision. Purbright remained by the window, watching the twilight gather over the town. The lamps along the square flickered one by one into life, pale halos against the deepening blue. It was the same light, he thought, that had once burned in that ill-fated lantern. Harmless now, almost tender, yet capable of revealing the smallest flaw if one looked long enough. He turned back to the vicar. You may wish to postpone Sunday's sermon, Mr. Wainfleet. I expect the congregation will have quite enough to discuss. The man gave a faint, humourless smile. I doubt I shall find words suitable to the occasion, Inspector. Then perhaps silence might serve better, Purbright said mildly. It's an underrated form of confession. Creek, still fussing with his briefcase, cleared his throat. Will there be further proceedings, Inspector? The public, you know, they'll want, well, certainty. Certainty, Purbright repeated softly. Yes, they always do. But I imagine the coroner will provide as much as decency allows. We needn't add to the spectacle. When the others had gone, he remained a while longer, tidying papers that did not require tidying. There was always that faint melancholy after a case concluded. Not triumph, but something quieter, like the last echo of a bell no one had meant to ring. The business of human misjudgment, he thought, was never a matter of victory, merely of understanding after the damage was done. Later, walking back through the market square, Purbright found the town already settling into its nightly rhythm. Shop blinds lowered, bicycles stacked neatly by the post office, and the scent of wet cobblestones rose with the evening breeze. At the bakery, Miss Teal was gossiping animatedly to a constable who nodded without listening. Somewhere, a cat leapt onto a sill, indifferent to the moral adjustments of humankind. He paused beneath the church tower, now dark and quiet. A faint outline of the lantern's base remained visible against the soil where the police had dug earlier, an ordinary patch of ground robbed at last of mystery. Purbright regarded it with mild sadness. So much noise, he thought, for something that had begun as a quarrel over a piece of brass. Yet in Flaxborough that was quite enough to disturb the balance of civilization. Love caught up to him then, slightly breathless. "We'll take Draycott to Norchard tonight, sir. Superintendent says he'll handle the statement in the morning. Good, he'll be more coherent after sleep." Guilt has a way of keeping people awake. Love hesitated.
"Do you think he really meant to kill her?"
Purbright looked at him kindly. "I think he meant to have his way, and she refused to yield. Most tragedies begin just there." They walked on in companionable silence. The square behind them dimmed into a pattern of windows, each one a little theatre of its own domestic drama. At the police station, Purbright paused before entering. "Go on, love, I'll be in shortly." When he was alone again, he crossed the street to the newsagent's window, where the evening edition already displayed its modest headline, "Lantern Mystery Solved, Arrest Made." Beneath it, a grainy photograph of the vicarage glowed faintly in the lamplight. The simplicity of the words amused him. Solved, as though that were ever truly possible. He thought of Mrs. Beasley. Proud, meddlesome, determined to guard what she considered sacred. Of Draycott, nursing his grievance like a relic of his own making, and of the town itself, which would soon fold this affair into its history of discreet scandals and polished sympathies. Flaxborough would heal, as it always did. Its people would talk, embellish, forget. But somewhere beneath the surface, beneath every polite greeting, every freshly swept doorstep, there would linger the faint awareness that decency was a fragile, negotiable thing. Purbright turned away from the window, buttoned his coat, and began the short walk home. The night was cold, the air faintly metallic, like the scent of rain on brass. As he passed the square, the clock struck 8, slow and deliberate. Each chime seemed to affirm what he already knew, that even in a town as peaceful as this, the truth was never far below the surface, waiting, patient as light behind a cloud, to be found when someone cared enough to look. The next morning dawned with the kind of indifferent sunlight that belongs only to English towns after scandal. It fell neatly upon the shop fronts, the vicarage gate, the war memorial, all appearing to the casual passer-by as though nothing remarkable had ever disturbed their equilibrium. Flaxborough's calm had resumed its post, tidy and self-assured, though beneath it conversations brewed like slow kettles. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station earlier than usual, his hat damp from a thin mist. He greeted Sergeant Love, who was halfway through a modest breakfast of sausage rolls and resignation. "Draycott's been quiet, sir," Love reported. "Slept a bit.
Asked for tea.
Said he wanted to write something down." "Good," Purbright said, hanging his coat. "Let him. Words can sometimes help tidy a man's conscience, even if the corners stay dusty." He sat at his desk and began reviewing the notes from the inquiry, the statements, the sketches, the photographs. Everything in order, as procedure demanded. Yet, as his eyes lingered on the final report, Purbright felt the faint unease of unfinished thought. Justice, though technically achieved, seemed to him an oddly human thing, a matter not of rightness, but of arrangement. Like furniture shifted to make a room look larger, Love hovered by the door. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "about Mrs. Beasley. Her sister's coming to take the house. Says she'll sell it off before winter." Purbright nodded.
"Probably for the best."
Houses, like people, shouldn't sit too long with memories. He closed the folder, rose, and walked to the window. Outside, the square was already alive with the small theatre of ordinary life. A milk lorry rattling past, a cyclist dodging a puddle, a child tugging a reluctant dog. The town, ever industrious in its amnesia, was polishing away the last traces of curiosity. By midday, the paperwork was done, the statement signed, the machinery of law satisfied. Superintendent Chubb called from headquarters to congratulate him on the case's efficient conclusion. Purbright thanked him politely, though he could not help smiling at the word conclusion. There were no real conclusions in police work, only pauses between questions. That afternoon, he took a slow walk through the high street. Shopkeepers nodded, some with cautious respect, others with the wary gratitude owed to one who had tidied an embarrassing mess. Mrs. Teal waved from the bakery. "We're all relieved, Inspector. So dreadful, that business." "You must feel ever so proud," Purbright smiled faintly. "Pride, Mrs. Teal, is a dangerous indulgence. It tends to invite repetition." He continued down toward the churchyard, where leaves, crisp and gold, had begun to gather in quiet drifts. The vicarage stood locked and silent, its windows shuttered. Somewhere inside, the air still carried the ghost of argument and remorse. Yet, to the world outside, it was already becoming history. He paused by the gate, noticing the faint tracks where police boots had once pressed the gravel. Time, he thought, would erase even those. Perhaps that was the truest mercy life offered. The slow fading of footprints. Love joined him a moment later, hands thrust into his coat pockets. "Funny thing, sir," he said.
"After all that noise, it feels—"
"Too quiet now. Peace often does," Purbright replied. "We miss the sound of what we've survived." They stood together, listening to the wind rustle the ivy along the wall. Then, with a soft exhale, Purbright turned back toward the square. "Come on, love, let's get some lunch before the world invents another mystery." As they walked away, the church bell tolled one, gentle and unhurried. Behind them, the vicarage remained still,
dignified in its silence, while the town, resilient,
unrepentant, resumed its usual gossip about weather, council rates, and the price of bread. For Inspector Purbright, the case was closed, but as he crossed the street, he allowed himself one last quiet thought, that every secret in Flaxborough slept lightly, and someday someone would stir them awake again.